COP28 webinar by CSE. COP28 approaches in 3 weeks from now, and one of the most important headers to be discussed is the Global Stocktake. But before I proceed with more on the Global Stocktake, I want to take a moment to introduce the excellent panel that we have with us here today. We have Sunita Narayan, who is the Director General at CSE. We have Navroz Dubash, Professor at the Center for Policy Research. And we have Manjeet Dhakkal, Head of the LDC Support Team and Director Climate Analytics South Asia. And he is also an advisor to the chair of the LDC group. So all three of our experts are veterans in the climate policy space, and they have closely observed the decades of effort that have led us to this moment where the first global stocktake really culminates. And today we'll also be hearing from my colleague Tamanna Sengupta from CSE's Climate Change Program. Before I hand over to Tamanna, we'll talk for a quick minute about what the Global Stocktake essentially is. So established under the Article 14 of the Paris Agreement, the Global Stocktake is essentially an evaluation of countries' progress towards global climate action. In 2015, countries agreed on concluding the first GST in 2023, with the process repeating every 5 years thereafter. Now, in this current environment of growing mistrust between developed and developing countries, as well as worsening climate change impacts, the GST is actually more important than ever before. It's not just a mirror to countries' progress, but it's also a defining moment for equitable climate action over the next decade. We have found, and we also hold very high expectations from the GST. It is supposed to be both a stock-taking exercise evaluating past action or inaction, as well as setting the course for the way forward. Many have said that the expectation is that the GST should guide future NDCs, which need to be ratcheted upwards, NDCs or climate pledges. But the GST also has elements on loss and damage and finance and means of implementation, which are absolutely necessary to implement the more ambitious NDCs. Global South countries have made very specific demands, and while we do hope that no demand stalls discussions and thereby progress, it is also important that poor and vulnerable countries stand their ground and don't accept watered-down compromises that will define the rest of this decade for us in terms of climate action. So we hope that the panel today will dig into some of these difficult questions. With that, I'll hand over to Tamanna, my colleague, who will introduce our new briefing paper. So Tamanna, over to you.
Thank you so much, Avantika. I'd like to start with a brief background of the process of the Global Stocktake itself. It is divided into 3 key phases. The first is of information collection. The second is the technical phase, which analyzes the information collected over 3 technical discussions held over a year. The result of that was a synthesis report, which released a couple of months ago. And finally, we are heading into the political phase, which is expected to give us certain concrete outcomes at COP28 in December. For this particular paper, we assessed over 35 submissions made by countries and negotiating blocs to the UNFCCC. These submissions were specifically highlighting their expectations from the GST process outputs. We also held discussions with negotiators from 7 blocs and countries, both developed and developing, to better understand their positions on the process. And finally, we analyzed data on past gaps, current progress, and the future needs to add more weight to the positions that we were seeing. We ended up with this summary table where you'll see that the green blocks denote countries which showed agreement to a specific element or a specific perspective. Now, there were 2 submission cycles, and in the second cycle, some countries had changed their stance on certain elements, or there were new additions. So what you're seeing on the paper, on the table, is a representation of the absolutely final submissions that we found. Overall, it's very clear that there is a unity among developed countries on specific perspectives, and then developing countries have more or less a unity on certain perspectives, and both these perspectives are almost opposite to each other. We will go more in depth into these debates in the coming slides, but before we do that, just 2 exceptions we see in the fossil fuel phase-out element. The African group of negotiators in yellow, they have a uniquely mentioned perspective where they say that the developed countries should be the one to lead fossil fuel phase out. while the developing countries should have the space to use fossil fuels to grow their economies before they transition away. And Russia has specifically mentioned that they are a fossil fuel dependent economy, and complete fossil fuel phase out can be detrimental to their social well being. The first of the most contentious debates is that on pre-2020 gaps. So the Kyoto Protocol and its Doha Amendment, it had given a timeline till 2020 to some developed countries under the Annex 1 to curb their emissions to a certain target. Most of the countries did not ratify the protocol, hence they did not meet the targets, and this has led to gaps in global climate ambition that was expected from these countries. Developing countries have now said that the GST process it has to account for these past pre-2020 failures of the developed countries to curb their emissions, while developed countries hold the view that pre-2020 is not as important as the current emission rise after 2019. Hence, this is one of the key debates over historical emissions versus current and future emissions. We then have fossil fuel phase out. We are expecting this to be a crucial discussion this year, while we also note that many developing countries are still fossil dependent and many developed countries are still expanding oil and gas explorations. So, while no one is vocally against fossil fuel phase out, we do see that many countries, as you see in the map, the uncolored regions had no mention of fossil fuels at all. There were some, mostly the vulnerable countries, such as the least developed countries or the Alliance of Small Island States, who advocated very clearly for all fossil fuel phase out. And mostly the developed economies, including the UK and the US, they advocate for a phase out of unabated fossil fuels. This abatement language more or less refers to their investment in carbon dioxide removal technology, which is something that is still under scrutiny as to how effective it is in mitigation. Next, we have the sources of climate finance. Now, so far, whatever climate finance has come in has mostly come as loans. It has increased debt for developing countries. They now, therefore, want a more concrete commitment of public grant-based finance coming from developed economies. The developed countries are now increasingly focusing on including private finance in the negotiations process. They want to do this through innovative sources, which include taxes, which include philanthropic funding, and which also include expanding the contributor base to include newer emitters like China, Saudi Arabia. And the concern here is for developing countries is whether this focus on private finance will again increase debt stress. Also, the fact that if this happens, it does not hold global north countries accountable to their historical responsibility to finance mitigation and adaptation in the developing nations. We then have the IPCC. Just a little bit of context as to why this is an issue. A very recent study has found that under the IPCC models, it is implied that the highly developed countries will retain a 44% share of the remaining global carbon budget, having emitted over 50% of historical emissions, while the least developed countries will have only 4% of the remaining global carbon budget compared to their historical share of less than 1%. This inherent inequity in the IPCC models is what is the basis for this particular disagreement. It was led by India, a call to acknowledge that there are gaps in the way that the IPCC models function. And very recently, countries like Brazil, Saudi Arabia, South Africa have given the weight to this particular call as well. The essential demand here is that by the time the next GST comes across in 5 years, there are better changes to the way that the IPCC models function. Finally, we have equity. Equity being one of the core principles of the UNFCCC is, as Avantika mentioned, also a core for the GST process itself. But there is a lot of growing debate over what the definition of equity really is. Developing nations still hold it to what it means in the UNFCCC, which is that historical emitters have to be held accountable and that they should be equitably taking up space in the remaining global carbon budget. But for developed countries, they believe that equity should now have a change in definition and instead of focusing on historical emissions, focus on current emerging emissions. And they also believe that the bifurcation of developed developing is becoming outdated and that list needs to change. Hence, as you see in the map, this is one space where there is a near complete divide between the global south and the global north. Equity is also important because it has been contentious in many places, including the most recent loss and damage funding negotiation. where USA very explicitly said that any reference to equity in the loss and damage fund text is unacceptable to them. So, how the GST holds developed countries accountable for their historical emissions, to what extent it will include emerging emitters, is important for other parallel processes as well. I will now hand it over to Avantika to take us through the next few slides.
So thanks so much, Tamanna. I'll just spend the last couple of minutes of our presentation talking about some further questions that still remain. We've seen that there are very stark differences on key positions that exist. There are still a number of open questions on how the GST's outcome should really be shaped. The first among them is how we really assess responsibility. We know that emerging and developing economies are very low contributors to historical emissions. They rank far below historical polluters. In particular, here we've shown 7 historical polluter countries: the United States, European Union, Russia, UK, Japan, Canada, and Australia. And the GST must represent past gaps along with proposing actions for the future. The second question that we've encountered is how to ensure that the phase out of all fossil fuels happens in an equitable manner. So we do know that it is imperative that all fossil fuels must be phased out to moderate the worst impacts of the climate crisis. But most negotiations today stress on phasing out coal among the fossil fuel discussions. And coal is primarily used in developing economies of Asia, countries like South Africa. Developed countries are much more reliant on oil and gas, which are subject to much less scrutiny. And we do hope that the responsibility for holding the global north to lead the fossil fuel phase out is not sidelined once we encounter what is going to be a word jumble related to fossil fuel phase down, abatement, and so on. Thirdly, is the issue of inadequate adaptation finance. The latest UNEP adaptation gap report finds that adaptation needs are now even higher than previously estimated. And the currently operational goal of doubling adaptation finance will only address 5 to 10% of the current gap. So there are definite questions about how the GST will reinforce the urgency to ensure that adaptation needs are met with commensurate financing. And this is a big priority for many developing countries. And lastly, it's still quite open-ended how the global stocktake will influence other ongoing processes, which are ongoing negotiations. So here we've spotlighted the issue of loss and damage, which is facing some very contentious and tense negotiations, as we saw at the transitional committee meetings. But it's really unclear how the global stocktake will kind of guide the next steps of some of these negotiations. We also have the new collective quantified goal on climate finance, which is due to conclude next year. Negotiations on the GGA, or the global goal on adaptation, are also ongoing. And while the GST shouldn't necessarily prejudge the outcomes of some of these ongoing negotiations, the issues are very crucial, and the GST really must amp up the urgency to conclude these negotiations ambitiously and in good faith. That's what our initial sense is. So with that, I'll hand over to Sunita ma'am to give her opening comments and present the way forward.
Look, Avantika, go ahead and present the way forward, and then we will take it from there, please.
Sure. So the way we've looked at it is that the global stocktake is really an opportunity to move discussions forward in good faith, to resolve the outstanding issues between the global north and south. And essentially, as Sunita ma'am has been advocating for decades, to work towards an agreement that is rule-based for future action to combat climate change. So under the 3 headers of mitigation, adaptation, and means of implementation, we do believe that for mitigation, countries should be held accountable for their historical emissions as a part of historical responsibility. At the same time, the GST is under a very difficult mandate to provide a direction for future ambition. And we need fossil fuel phase out of all fossil fuels, not just coal, to be considered and accounted for in the commitments from all countries which are nationally determined. On adaptation, we must urgently acknowledge the absence of effective adaptation finance. Along with that, loss and damage, which is now being a separate discussion header in the GST, separate from adaptation, it's very crucial to push for access for loss and damage financing for all developing countries, access to public grant-based finance that is not debt-creating. In terms of means of implementation, developing countries need to be given the space to increase their emissions in the short to medium term and also receive international cooperation to transition towards low carbon economies. And the global stocktake can be a powerful enabler to enhance these means of implementation and facilitate this transition. So that's the end of our presentation, and over to Sunita, ma'am.
Thank you, Avantika. And can you also be getting a lot of requests for your report as well as your presentation? I know you'll put it up, but maybe you could end your presentation by showing us a copy of the report, at least the cover of the report.
Sure. I will just share my screen and do that. Just bear with me for a few seconds.
So as you will, as Avantika is putting this up, let me, okay, good. So, and Avantika, maybe you can put a link to your page on the chat so that people can get it. So this is our report. Please download it. Please see it. The effort is to put together an understanding of what's happening so that we can actually have a more informed discussion, both from the South, particularly from the South, from policymakers in the South, so that they can, in Dubai, make sure that their positions are understood. Thank you, Avantika. Maybe you can take it down and I will start the conversation. Thank you. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We are really happy that you could come. This is, I think, the second in our series of pre-COP webinars that we are doing. We are being very ambitious this year, perhaps foolishly so, but we are doing, I think, 8 or 9 webinars up to pre-COP, essentially as an effort to put out information. I mean, a huge role has to be to make us all understand what's at stake and what are the positions that need to be taken by civil society, by governments, so that we can strive towards a better outcome. We know climate change is an existential threat. We know that developing countries, countries of the South, are the worst affected. We also know that the negotiations, international negotiations for an effective, ambitious, and equitable climate agreement often do not meet our expectations. These times when we will go to Dubai are perhaps even the worst times that are there in the world. We are more divided, more polarized, more distracted than ever before. On the other hand, climate change is a reality. It is, its urgency is also screaming at us. So there are both these issues in front of us. And it's within that, the global stocktake is a very important opportunity, just as Avantika said, to be able to set the framework for the future. The issue is not really about, what happened, but the issue is, what is that equitable, just climate agreement that will have to be ambitious? And before I turn to Manjeet and ask him to give us his opening, I just want to emphasize that for us at CSE, the issue of climate justice is not a moral issue only. It's an imperative if you need an ambitious agreement. And we say this very clearly because the fact is 70% of the world population, 70% of the world population, this is excluding China, because China, in our view, is already today the world's, not only the world's largest annual producer, but on a per capita basis, as well as the share of the carbon budget, it will catch up with the US in 2030. That, of course, is if the US meets the commitment that it has set itself to do. But this means that 70% of the world population still does not have access to development. And this is at a time when the world has run out of the carbon budget. By 2030, we will have run out of the carbon budget to keep us below the guardrail of 1.5 degrees centigrade rise. Now, I say this with some vehemence because please remember, we are only at 1.1 degrees centigrade rise, and this is the kind of devastation that we are seeing in our world. CSE last week released a report on extreme weather events, and I would urge all of you to take a look at it because that recording of extreme weather events tells us just how insidious, but just how devastating climate change has already become. Now, this is therefore the time when we will run out of the budget in 2030. Vast numbers of the world population will not have access to development. Now, what do? Do they stop breathing? Do they just stop existing? Obviously not. They will grow. And as they grow, whether they use dirty, polluting fuel, whether they use household level biomass, which is bad for them, those will add to our common jeopardy. So the issue of equity is something that is an imperative for an ambitious climate agreement. And Navroz is my colleague in arms on this. From way back in the 90s, we have been saying this, that this is an issue that you cannot ignore. It's an issue that you cannot negate. It's an issue that you cannot see as something that is part of something that happens later. And someday when Navroz and I write a book on on this entire climate history, I think he will tell you how many times we have cried, or at least I have cried, because the words have not been listened to. Today, there is no choice. Today, you have to listen. And that's where GST is. 2023, 2024, you need to understand that question of the rest of the world is center stage. And it cannot be put away for tomorrow. And that's really where, to us, the hopes of GST is, and why we wanted this conversation between two veterans of the climate negotiations, so that they can help us to understand a little more of what are the expectations. And that's particularly for you, Manjeet, because you're at the center of a lot of what is going to happen. And the LDC group is one of the strongest groups with a very powerful voice at the COP. So what do you see? What does the group see as your expectations from GST, the most difficult issues, and how do you want to move ahead? Manjeet.
Thank you, Sunita. I feel like it's so interesting to listen to you. Yeah, I think like that's more interesting that for you to continue. Thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation, and also the excellent report that Avantika and Tamanna presented earlier. I think all in line with many other knowledge products, excellent analysis that we have seen from CSC in past. Yeah, so really helpful. And also, I think I appreciate like the series of this webinar. I think these are very helpful for people also to get that understanding in terms of what we do at the COP. But also, I think these are also a strong reminder for people in terms of what needs to be done. So yeah, really appreciate. Sunita, I do agree with you. I think the time is quite difficult, the geopolitics, and there are a lot of other distraction as well. But I think the science is clear. The impacts that countries have started experiencing in a very higher rate are all clear evident. So we don't have a time to wait and keep negotiating. So I think the action needs to happen, and I think that's where the Global Stocktake was designed in the Paris Agreement to have a reflection on this every after 5 years. So also this first one is extremely important because this will set a precedent for the upcoming Global Stocktake. But we also believe that we don't have a luxury of time of having a many rounds of Global Stocktake. That's what we get from science, the IPCC report, but also when we have to respond back to the people in the ground, we can't tell them that, okay, just wait, this time we'll do a little bit, and then after 5 years, we'll have a next Global Stocktake and we'll come up with full package. So I think that's not going to happen. So that's also the one of the reason for us, this makes a lot of sense and has a high priority. I think as we discussed, like there are two major, like the area that we see. One, looking at back, like what has happened as of now in terms of implementation of the Paris Agreement, but also like overall climate process. Many reports as of now, and I think as it was explained in the presentation, the technical reports have made clear that there is a lack of ambition across the elements of the Paris Agreement in terms of emission reduction, in terms of finance to be mobilized, in terms of adaptation, support, let alone the loss and damage. So it's clear there is a gap. So now we also believe that this has to chart a path in terms of moving ahead, a clear path. And in the UNFCCC process, like we are very good in terms of making good announcement, places, we celebrate, and then we go. So I think that's also one thing that we may have to think about with a clear follow-up plan, taking this forward. So now in terms of the content, like what we want to see, and I think the last slide on the way forward was very useful on the major three pillar: mitigation, adaptation, and means of implementation. And I will add a little bit on loss and damage. That's remain as one of the highest priority for us. So in terms of mitigation, obviously the Global Stocktake has to set a path that will take us to 1.5 degree pathway. And the process that we have set up under the Paris Agreement is, when we talk about the next round of NDC, it will be the NDC with the in date of 2035. For us, that's still quite far away. So we want this Global Stocktake also to guide the action to happen within this critical decade, and in the Paris Agreement process that fits with the another program called Mitigation Work Program, whose mandate is to be to have action within this critical decade. Also, in terms of mitigation, that's more like the developed country obviously have to take a lead, and that's what we have agreed in the Paris Agreement. I think in the presentation it was well explained in terms of the historical emission. We also believe that there has to be a contribution from other as well, and that's where the voluntary contribution, that's where it remains. And I think the presentation made it clear in terms of the fair share where it needs to be done. But yeah, obviously we count on the historical emission, but also I think the contribution from every side. Particularly in case of Nepal, and it's not because we don't produce fossil fuel, but we try to link this with one of the scientific report on the assessment of Hindu Kush Himalaya region, that even if the global target that we have agreed of limiting temperature rise to 1.5 degree, 1/3 of the ice in the Himalaya will melt, which obviously will have a bigger consequences for a country like Nepal, who has a huge dependency in terms of hydropower, in terms of agriculture, fresh water. And this is not an issue only of the mountain, but also linking it with the downstream. So that gives us with one strong rationale that let's try to contribute from every side where possible, respecting those principles that we have agreed. I also want to note that in terms of mitigation, and I think this is one area that CSC has hugely contributed, the co-benefit. And one particular example in terms of air pollution, that's I think one thing that is common in many of the South Asian countries and others as well. So if we just take an example of the electric vehicle, and I would emphasize more on the public vehicle, non-motorized vehicle, I think that's one area that will obviously contribute in terms of emission reduction, but also will give a direct result in the cities that where we come from. In case of Nepal, we have also advocated in terms of electric cooking, which obviously help in the rural areas as well. So that's more in terms of the mitigation with 1.5 degree as a North Star. In terms of finance, I think the presentation was very clear, the means of implementation and the gap that exists. Again, it's very clear the window of opportunity for 1.5 degrees narrowing. And if we can limit the temperature rise to 1.5 degree, the need of finance, and particularly for adaptation, will increase. So that's where we want this global stocktake also to provide a guidance, linking it with the other pillar of the Paris Agreement, because in most of the cases we discuss adaptation, mitigation, finance in silos, and this is an opportunity to link everything, bring together. Also, the context of the preference of grant for many of the least developed country, and the burden that countries have in terms of the loan, the debt. So that needs to be addressed, which is one of the special circumstances that we see for the least developed country. It also must, I think, clearly provide the guidance in terms of the need of public finance, because obviously the climate change is not about the business, it's about the impact that the communities are facing in the ground. So I think those messages must be very clear. And any action that we define in terms of mitigation or adaptation, I think the means of implementation remains key. In case of adaptation, we want a global stocktake to help clarify the work that is being done in the other work stream called global goal and adaptation. In mitigation, the things are clear. There is a lack of political commitment, but the targets are clear. Adaptation is very difficult to understand. We don't have a overarching or the sectorial target in the climate change process in terms of adaptation. So we want the global stocktake to work hand in hand with the global goal and adaptation, both closing their mandate by the end of this year, to have a clarity in terms of the clear target across the thematic area that we have already agreed, and some of them are like water, agriculture, mountain, and so on. I think in the presentation it was very clear the inadequate adaptation finance and the doubling of adaptation finance is not enough. And I think the figure was there as well, like 5 to 10%. It only addressed 5 to 10%. So we also believe, and that's obviously the LDC group have mentioned this many times. The doubling was a good start, but that's absolutely not enough. Either it has to go through manifold. They were also thinking about the doubling renewable energy, tripling energy efficiency, and maybe quarterling the adaptation support, but still quarterling may not be enough. So it has to go manifold because that it does not really fulfill the need. Finally, in terms of loss and damage, yes, this is something that we want a global stocktake to have a perfectly clear message that this is different to adaptation. Because many times we see an attempt of mixing loss and damage with adaptation, and to some extent the outline of the decision that we have agreed in the last bone session has already spelled out loss and damage separately to adaptation. So we want that to preserve and continue. The Transitional Committee on Loss and Damage had made a progress earlier in the weekend in the meeting in Abu Dhabi, which is not perfect that we have achieved, we have been looking for, but we know it's a negotiation and the developing country as a whole has taken it as a compromise. But if there is any attempt again to further negotiate on that in terms of the many other areas, but also the obligation in terms of finance, I think that will make it difficult. So we believe that this has already given a positive start, and there is a lot of work to be done. It was not perfect that we were looking for. We were not the one favoring the multilateral development bank to take a role, but there has been an interim arrangement made with many conditions spelled out, where the major role will remain in the committee, in the board that will be formed through the party-driven process. So we want this, the outcome of the Transitional Committee to have a full acknowledgement in the global stocktake, but also provide a clear guidance in terms of action and support. Loss and damage is not only about discussing next few years, but a real impact that countries are facing in the ground. So finally, let me close by saying that as I think briefly mentioned earlier, the roadmap, which remains key for all these decisions that we will be making, and that can be done by providing guidance for countries to come up with an ambitious NDC by 2025, but also use the message from the global stocktake for those countries, particularly the developed countries, to provide finance as per the need, as guided by the outcome of the global stocktake. Yeah, that's where I stop, and yeah, happy to respond if there are any questions.
Thank you, Manjeet. That's very comprehensive, very clear. So thank you very much for putting forward and helping us to understand what are the positions that need to be taken for this agreement. Navroz, can I call upon you now? I know that you were involved at the earlier stages, but you have a view of many of these issues going back from many, unfortunately, decades. So if I can call upon you to help us to see, and really, how does this get positioned at the COP28? What is it that we should be working towards so that we can get a successful outcome? And as Manjeet said, maybe not a perfect outcome, but still, given the environment and given the conditions of the world, at least an outcome that we can work with as we go forward. Navroz?
Wonderful. It's really panel with you, Sunita, again, and with CSC colleagues, and of course, Manjeet. Thanks so much for inviting me. You talked about the sort of years of walking the same path, and it really has been, as you say, not just years but decades. I was involved in some of the conversations at Sharm el-Sheikh on the GST, but to be perfectly honest with you, we've sort of pulled back from the day-to-day, week-to-week kind of tracking of these. So my comments, if it's okay with you, will pull back a little bit and take a slightly broader picture. As we know, the GST, this is the first time it's actually being done, and there's a lot of uncertainty about what on earth it can actually accomplish and what it will shift. What it can shift. At one level, on some of the questions, and recognizing, as Manjeet said, that the GST is definitely not just about mitigation, it's also about means of implementation, it's also about adaptation and loss of and damage separately. But when it comes to the mitigation part of the story, in a sense, the stock take, the GST can't add that much numerically, because after all, there's now a proliferation of gap reports and climate action tracker reports and the UNFCCC's own reports. So we don't learn that much just in terms of the number. It may go up and down a little bit, and is it so many years and so many gigatons, or plus minus 5. But we know we're in trouble. We know that we're not on track. One of the things I like that the GST says is it doesn't just talk about an ambition story. It also talks about an implementation story. And I think that's very, very important, because I think a lot of what's been happening under political pressures is we're kicking the can down the road. We talk about what will happen in 2050, 2060, 2070. Should it happen in 2045? What we really need to be focused on is what happens this decade everywhere. And to think that you're going to hold politicians accountable for pledges 30, 40 years down the road it doesn't make a lot of sense. So the GST, I think, serves two functions. One, I think it serves to, the battleground will be on certain key messages that have to come out in ways that I think from the point of view of, I think many of us on this call are the right formulation of those messages, right? It has to underscore some things very, very clearly. I think given this political moment, the importance of maintaining momentum on loss and damage and operationalizing this fund, that has to be underscored very firmly by the GST. I think talking about enhancing adaptation funding, putting it in the context, as your CSC report nicely does, of large debt burdens and therefore the need for more grant funding, as well as creative new sources of funding. I think I'm open to that conversation, whether it's currency transaction tax or shipping or whatnot. Some sort of global public good kind of mobilization, but making the point that we can't just keep limping along with adaptation as the sort of the ignored half, the forgotten sort of sibling in the corner. The third message that I think has to be underscored, and this is obviously going to be a big battle for this COP, is moving to the language of fossil fuel phase out, not just coal. And then this question also, I think that Tamanna flagged about unabated versus not having that word in there. And I think trying to push for fossil fuel phase out without the unabated is going to be very, very important. It's probably a battle that's very hard to win in the GST context, but what the GST says about that, I think, will lay the ground for the next few years. So those are, in a sense, some of the things that are very, very important for the GST to say. And obviously, all of these things that I've said are informed, and I should have been explicit about it, but it's sort of part of the DNA at this point, I guess. They're all informed by perspectives on equity and common but differentiated responsibility, right? The fossil fuel story is why, yes, of course, coal is more polluting, but some countries have more of one fuel, some countries have more of another. Why would you single out coal? And as CSE colleagues have pointed out, the oil and gas are more what the West depends on. The way I've tried to articulate this as a principle and put some submissions into the GST as well is, if we have to keep fossil fuels at the ground, if we have scarce fossil fuels, then who gets to burn their fossil fuels? How do we use the burnable fossil fuels? And a good principle might be, use the scarce fossil fuels where they contribute the most to global welfare. And that will be in countries where the development impact per ton of fossil fuel is the greatest, which naturally will be in the poorest countries. The way in which the GST says this now, it's a phrase they dance around a little bit, but they say, before a full phase out, fossil fuels will remain important for some, particularly those least able to afford to transition away from those fuels. So there's a hook in there for something like this kind of argument, which brings me to the second sort of large use of the GST. Can we, and this again comes back to the CSE report, can we use the GST to shake loose the conversation in some way? Because as the report shows, we are very much continue to be locked in these kinds of north-south battles. Is there a way to have a productive conversation in certain elements that take forward equity, but in ways that are clever about how we set the agenda going forward? And I don't know how much longer I have, Sunita, but maybe 2 or 3 minutes.
Please, Navroz, very important.
Okay, thank you. So how do we, so this is just an idea, a speculation that I've been writing about a little bit, others have been writing about as well. How might we do this? So one of the what CSE colleagues have put forward is looking at where we are. Can we move in a sense to a more defined, structured, rules-based construct? And Sunita and I have discussed and debated this over the years, and I think I've been a little bit more partial to the Paris Agreement than she has, and I think we have honest differences and so on, and it's fine to discuss those. My own take on that is that in the current political context, trying to move back to a rules-based world risks putting us into a loop. So, for example, China should move to an Annex 1 of, and I would agree with that sentiment. But what is the cutoff? What is the basis? What is the point at which that happens? One can spend an awful long time doing that, because what will happen to China today will happen to South Africa and Brazil tomorrow, and will happen to India day after, and so on. So you can see how we could really end up in a bit of a tangle. So what's the option? So in my view, one way of looking at this, and this is now I've said what I in terms of adaptation and loss and damage, it's very clear that we need more support. And we shouldn't be ignoring those aspects. Let me just focus for a minute just on the mitigation part of the story. Is there a way in which developing countries now take more control over the development agenda, or the low carbon development agenda, if you like, right? And say, here's how we envision what our low carbon future looks like. Really envision, not just in broad brushstrokes, not just pulling $1 trillion out of here and $2 trillion out of there, but actually mapping it out, building the planning institutions. This is something else I've written about, building on what Manjeet said, this idea of co-benefits, which I've gone on about for a long time as well. Many of us find it kind of an interesting construct, not ignoring the fact that there are trade-offs too, but that there are co-benefits. Emphasizing the fact that energy needs are going to continue to be important and are going to grow. We can't have a low carbon transition on the back of shrinking energy. And so this challenge of decarbonizing while growing energy is a very particular problem to much of the developing world, right? In countries that haven't peaked yet. Given all of that, what will it take to define that low carbon development pathway? And then what would it take for us to receive support, means of implementation, and so on and so forth, to credibly go down that pathway, right? Really spelling that out and trying to construct this kind of bargain that says, okay, we are not saying that low carbon is something we're putting off to the future, because it's probably in our interest as well, both from a climate point of view and in some cases from a development point of view. What does that look like? And how do we tell a story about mobilizing the capital? It'll probably have to be not just public, it'll probably have to be private capital as well, given the scale. Because in all countries, this is a capital-intensive transition. But we also have to make it clear that this is not an easy transition, right? We are locked into all kinds of structural rigidities around fossil fuels. So, for example, coal cross-subsidizes railways, passenger rail in India. These are not things you can change on a dime. Just because renewable energy prices have fallen, it doesn't mean that suddenly you're home free. These are very complex structures that have to be untangled, and the risk of not having energy can't be placed on the back of of India's poor, anybody else's poor. But if we can come up with those sorts of plans, and also for adaptation, frankly, what are the clear needs, and put some investment and finance requirements to it, that might be the basis for a conversation where we are on a little bit more of the front foot. It's a way of internalizing equity too, by saying, here's what we think we need to have a low carbon transition that's resilient as well, but in ways where equity allows for the support to come in. And here again, there's flags in the GST, right? So they say things like, look at systems transformation. They observe that ambition and action and support go together. They have a phrase that says, making financial flows consistent with a pathway towards low carbon and climate resilient development. So can we pick up these kinds of tags? Maybe we wrap it in the language of conditional NDCs. So we really double down on that. We say, okay, fine, we're going to do a really serious NDC, but here's the conditions, and we're spelling it out in a great deal of detail. Maybe that's a way for, at least on the mitigation side, for us to use the GST to about a serious support for a serious low carbon transition in the next round of NDCs. So just to put that out there, 2 points. We have to use the GST to underscore certain things that I think we all know, but we really have to make sure that happens. And then can we use little bits and pieces within the GST to assemble this argument for, if you like, a needs-based construct? Others have written about this too. What would it take for us to satisfy and achieve our vision of a low-carbon future? Not McKinsey's vision or the World Bank's vision, but what is our vision that we have to develop? It then becomes incumbent on us to build the structures to develop that vision properly and the means of implementation required to get there. So I'll stop there. Thanks, Sunita.
No, fascinating, Navroz. I think that helps to sort of, put forward clearly what needs to be done as the world moves forward. We move forward because we need. I'm also clear about this, and I will ask Manjeet to also comment first on what you have to say, and then I can see we're running out of time. So I will try and sort of wrap up what Navroz has said and Manjeet has said, and some of the questions out there in my closing. But Manjeet, please. Your comments on what Navroz has said, some very wise words. One telling me rules-based important, but don't get lost in it because we can actually end up with losing more time, and we don't have that. Very, very important message. But two, it is very important for us to embed, to look at the low carbon future, but then put some flesh on it so that we can actually challenge the world with the money it requires. and not let the world dismiss us by saying we are not interested in doing anything. Am I paraphrasing you right, Navroz? Manjeet.
Thank you. I think the learning that we had, for example, from the previous process or from the Kyoto Protocol, so all those learnings has helped well designing the Paris Agreement and the way the global stocktake was put in place to have an opportunity to look back, but not only keep looking back, but also after you look back, also guide the process moving ahead. Like when I say this at the both front, like at the global multilateral process, there are linkages with many other things that we do. This has a linkage obviously with many other similar multilateral process, but also I think the different dynamics that we need to understand from where countries are coming from. But then that's obviously should not be an excuse for us not to take action, because we can tell the communities that are facing adverse impact of climate change, and the impacts are growing rapidly from where it was when this process started. So we need to find the best way how that can be addressed. Again, looking at the country level, the it is linked with the poverty. It is linked with the limited facility that the people have to survive. So obviously the lifestyles are different in different parts of the world. So I think there is no doubt that we are dealing with this complicated process, but I think it's also important for the and also that the responsibility that we need to deliver. So yeah, obviously, like every country, like a group, we go to this process, like also, I think with a very difficult balance of what needs to be done in terms of the global level for the survival of the humanity, but also then we have to think about the people back home. So the finding that perfect balance is obviously difficult in this process, but I think this is also on a positive note and an opportunity that is there in front of us to help course correct. I think that's the phrase that we keep hearing on the global stocktake, and also an opportunity to look things comprehensively. It is not only mitigation, and it is not only like one of the piece, and the way the loss and damage has grown as a major pillar. So let's take it and let's acknowledge it at the same level, because the more that the world can mitigate, obviously the need for funding would be less, but that didn't happen in past, and that's where we are here now. I agree, I think, with many things Navroz had said, but then we are also struggling, particularly in the LDC group, and when I hear the delegates, that how can we find the best way that that the action can be taken without putting a huge burden on vulnerable countries and those developing countries who also has much other needs that they need to address at home. But also we keep flagging this, that should not be an excuse for many not to take action. So I think there are excellent papers, analyses in terms of how this can be done, and also how the equity can be explained. And now, interesting, this time we have an agenda item on operationalizing the equity and CPDR. I'm sure first this has to be agreed, and in the process that we have seen in the recent years, it's not that easy to get any new agenda item, and including that there are in total 9 new agenda items that has been proposed. So before going to the COP, the process is already very complicated. Many of them are in favor of us. For example, the agenda item that relates to doubling adaptation finance, and also the more on implementation of the finance related obligation. But there are also a few other agenda items that could be very difficult. So yeah, so I think overall, so just want to conclude by saying that it was science, I think, that confirmed earlier that there are gaps. Now the impacts that we have been facing has given a clear message in terms of that the world can no more tolerate this, and the action needs to happen. So I think it was a very difficult but a perfect balance that has been taken in the Paris Agreement in terms of the countries to take a lead, the countries who can contribute further. So I think following that, if the global stocktake can pave a path forward uh, in terms of addressing this again in the critical decade, both in terms of mitigation action, but also in terms of mobilization of finance, that remains key. And that remains key for countries who have submitted NDCs with many conditional target, many like depending on the finance that will be mobilized. So we can't ask developing country saying that you haven't taken action if the funding is not there in place. So that I think that obligation also has to be taken very carefully. We like when I see the delegates from LDC, like it's a pressure from every side, because if so there are certain group of countries, like when the negotiation happen in terms of mitigation, we see the two clear division. For us, it's important the emission has to go down. There is obviously the huge division in terms of mobilization of finance. For us, the finance mobilization remain instrumental. There are division in terms of understanding loss and damage and addressing and paving the path for that. For us, that's another key important. And for us also the adaptation action, building resilience remains the high important. Like we can't forget adaptation, even with any new context. So it's difficult to be the one in the receiving end. But one thing that I must add, and I will close it, even the least developed countries whose capacities are constant, whose resources are constant, has presented many ambitious NDCs to show the leadership. So it's just a question for many other and those whose obligation remain there in the Paris Agreement, in the convention. Like if these countries can do, why not others? Yeah, I'll stop here.
Thank you, Manjeet. Very thoughtful. Thank you. So, overall, many comments have come, and thank you so much. Very supportive comments, and clearly very tough issues as well. The issue of coal is very important. But as we at CSE have made it clear, and we stuck our neck out, that it's not coal, it's energy. And, it's both coal, which has high CO2 emissions, but gas has half the CO2 emissions plus methane emissions. So from our point of view, all of it is a problem. And we must not only look at coal, we should look at energy as we move ahead. And I think that since Glasgow, I have seen now some change. And at least the wording now is not coal, but fossil fuel. The fight is about abated or not. I personally believe that if we can at least get a phase out of unabated fossil fuel into the text, it's a way, it's really a game changer as we move ahead. Because abatement will have costs, that is true, but abatement then will be done. Because right now, if you look at the recent report, in spite of the massive profits that the oil and gas companies have made, they have spent virtually nothing on their climate mitigation plans. So I think the pressure on them has to be much higher. And then you can really look at whether abated fossil fuels is cheaper or renewables is cheaper. It's also very clear that the renewable issue has its own challenges, and it cannot completely take over the energy futures of the world. We haven't seen that in any country, including all of Europe. They are both renewable and gas dependent or renewable and nuclear dependent. We haven't seen any country which is completely, and at the scale we're talking about. So I think the energy and the mitigation story is going to be absolutely key. And that is something that needs to be center stage at COP. So in my view, a few takeaways, if I may, for the wrap up of this one, I agree with both Manjeet and Navroz. I think there are certain issues on which we should have absolutely clear success points. And the first one of them has to be the loss and damage agreement and money in it. Pledges and money in the loss and damage agreement. It's also very clear, as Manjeet very rightly said, it's a very tenuous agreement. And we know, most of us have seen the role that the world's largest historical emitter played to undermine the agreement, the very carefully crafted agreement, which in some senses is a compromise all around. I'm not sure if the LDC groups got everything that they wanted in the loss and damage agreement. I'm absolutely sure that we as civil society should object a lot more to some of the words there. But the fact is, we have an agreement, the best there is today. What COP and what GST moving forward, the declaration has to do is to make sure that agreement is not reopened. That agreement is an agreement in which we can move ahead. Because as Navroz very clearly has said as well, we need speed today. We are seeing massive losses. We're seeing massive damages in countries. We have been publishing, Manjeet, again and again, all reports that are also showing the attribution of climate change to many of the disasters that we see around it. And it is very clear that there is a link to climate change when you look at the floods, when you look at the droughts, when you look at the extreme heat, the extreme cold events. And that is breaking the backs of the very poor in our world. So the loss and damage agreement is absolutely critical. A clear framing of the adaptation agreement with the issue of finance is clear as well, clearly needed. The report that Avantika had put out earlier in the year actually was quite an eye-opener for me as well, because we were all fixated on the issue of $100 billion and the issue of climate finance. But when we put together the full picture, we understood the links between, the climate finance and to which countries were they going? Where was renewable energy investment actually happening? And the fact that climate finance was neither concessional nor grant-based. And that if you looked at a country like Pakistan, post the horrific floods in Pakistan, and all the big words that the world community talked about Pakistan, the money Pakistan got was in for loans, which made a country which is already under debt further indebted. Now, that's not the nature of finance we need in our world. And that has to be spelled out, and that has to be clear when we look at both adaptation as well as loss and damage. Because yes, we need private sector finance, we need all other instruments of finance, but the fact is the core of the finance will have to be public, concessional, and grant-based. And I would also point to all of you the report that we released just some weeks ago on the voluntary carbon market, which even for somebody like me, who I thought can never get shocked anymore, I was absolutely shocked at the sheer audacity of the companies to call this market a carbon market which works for the poor or the planet. It does not. So the nature of finance will have to be very carefully looked at. We cannot anymore just say that private finance will come because the markets are there. The markets actually will never work for people or the planet unless the rules are made for it. So this then brings us to the issue of GST and the need to be able to look at adaptation, finance means, as well as loss and damage. Then comes the issue of mitigation. And I understand what Navroz is saying, and I appreciate his words of caution that, it's important for us to move ahead. Now, from the CSE point of view, we have been very clear that it is in our interest to come up with a low carbon trajectory as we move ahead. We have produced 2 reports, one on the iron and steel sector and the other on the cement sector. Very detailed reports, company by company, looking at the pathways going ahead. And it is very clear that we can have an accelerated roadmap in which we can double our cement production, double our iron and steel production, and yet half our emissions. It's possible, but it requires finance. And that's really where it is important for us to be able to challenge by putting out our own pathways with some robustness to be able to say, this is the pathway and this is what it will cost. Because this is the mitigation challenge. We have talked about 2050 as net zero, yet no country in the world today has a robust pathway on what it's going to do to reach net zero. We broadly know that a lot of it is going to be offsets, but we don't know how much. We don't know what it will mean. We don't know which sector. We know that there is CBAM in EU and there is IRA in the US, but we don't know what the year-to-year reductions are going to be. And as of now, whatever data we have, we cannot see them on track. So I think it's important but for us in the South, it is important to put forward a robust roadmap, conditional to money that we get. And that's something I totally agree with Navroz, something we in CSE have been advocating and actually working on sector by sector. We are now working on the aluminium sector. We are working on the hard to abate sectors. We are working on the power sector to be able to come up with a roadmap going forward. With data, with information, and of course, the financing is where the tricky issue is. That's where industry has to step in to look at what are the high ticket items which require money and how much. But it's possible to do. My last point is, and that's my slight disagreement with Navroz, I think GST is an opportunity to put together a framing for the future, Navroz. It's not just about the brass tacks, about loss and damage, adaptation, means of implementation, and mitigation. That's in the negotiations. But what we need is a framing. Now, I am very clear that the framing I am asking for, that we are demanding, is one which is difficult. It wasn't possible in 1992 when we had the Framework Convention on Climate Change. It was possible, actually. Let me correct myself. We did get an equitable framing in 1992. We did get something in Kyoto at the Berlin conference. But then since then, it has unraveled till we got to Paris. Now, the reason I am very critical of Paris is because what it did was to take apart the framework agreement to establish an agreement to say every country will do as much as it can. Now, that has really meant today we are back again. And if you look at Tamanna's excellent chart, the Navroz, each item there is like a déjà vu. Every one of those debates are something that have been happening and refuse to get reconciled. Who will pay? How much will they pay? Who will cut emissions? How much will they cut emissions? Who is more vulnerable? Who is less vulnerable? All those issues will only get resolved if we have a framing which says that countries will, that the agreement is based on rules in terms of the contribution, in terms of the emissions. Now, I understand that the world may not be ready for it. These are tough times. But on the other hand, without the framing, and this is the opportunity to get some words in, even if we don't get all the words in, to get the words in that we require an agreement which is based on equity, on justice, based on rules that are made for yesterday's polluters and tomorrow's polluters. I have no doubt in my mind, Navroz, that India must take on responsibility, but there has to be a cutoff point. You can't compare China and India today. You cannot talk about 10 to 2.5 gigatons and say this is equal. It isn't. And that's why it is critical that we have some framing. And that's my appeal. I know it's tough. I know it's probably impossible, but I think it is very, very tough for us. It is very important for us to keep asking for it. Navroz can bear me out on this, that from 1991, when we came out with Global Warming in an Unequal World, a case of environmental colonialism, CSC at least has stayed firm on this demand. I know we never get it, but that does not mean that we do not ask for it. And that ultimately is to be our entire combined effort to do something which works for the planet, but most importantly, for the people who are today victims of extreme weather events, climate impacts. So that's our hope for GST. And I think, thank you, Tamanna, thank you, Avantika, for helping me at least to understand the contours of the discussions. Thank you, Manjeet, for all the role you play, and please keep pushing. We're there, whatever help you need, we're there. But thank you for the work that you do. And thank you, Navroz, for being there always, and for all your words. And I do listen. We may disagree, but we always listen to each other. And I think that's the strength of our work together. So thank you, everyone, for joining us. And the next, I do want to make the Global Warming in an Unequal World available on the CSE website. I think Navroz has it in his book, but I need to dig it out and put it on our website. Avantika, please remind me, we need to do this. I mean, I think it is a report which we wrote at a very different time.
We will do it.
Still very regularly cited and referenced.
But very different time in the world. I call it the age of innocence, but we still have to believe that we can make the change, and we have to. So thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you for your wonderful comments. And we look forward. And Shikhar, can you send us your email so that we can make sure we send you a copy of the report? Just send it to Avantika so that she can send you a copy. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. Our next webinar is next week, Avantika. You've put out the notice. And
yes,
I hope
November
you will
16th.
join. Many of the questions you're asking, our colleagues will reply in terms of what we believe are the possible low carbon pathways for a country like India. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Bye, everyone.
Navroz. Thank you, Manjeet. See you hopefully soon. Bye.